So, hey.
Hello.
Hello. Welcome, and welcome to yet another fucking podcast. Um, I I love to get you to introduce yourself. So, um, maybe your name, and then maybe something that you could share that would have us know you a little bit. Like, what's something about you that would have us like, oh, I feel connected to you. I feel like I know who you are. Like, just some little detail about your life or who you are that people closer to you would know and people further away from you wouldn't. And then maybe just kind of your work in the world, like what you're up to in the world.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Damien, for having me. And my name is Emerald Figueroa, and something that's like personal about me is that I died twice technically. So in two different near-death experiences, I completely died, fully conscious, and came back. And one of them I drowned in the ocean when I was 5 years old. And the second one, I was 21 years old. And I don't have to go into, great detail on that one, but each one of them has its own special, story and conversation. But when I was 21, I actually had a medicine man, completely random event, like saved me from dying. He like set up a whole teepee and pulled me in and brought me back into my body.
Wow.
And it was kind of like one of those fluke incidences where if my mom had taken me to the hospital, I would have died. There's no doubt, because of what was actually happening to my system. So I was in the right place at the right time to be saved and brought back. And that's like a whole nother podcast.
Okay, cool. Noted. I'm definitely intrigued, but noted. That's for later. It's for another time.
Yes. So what I do in the world, I do many things. I'm like a jack of all trades and wear many hats. But one of my deepest desires and passions in life is to teach about body awareness and the intuition. So for me, that actually translated into a non-hormonal pregnancy prevention method called EOSOMA. And EOSOMA basically it teaches women how to not conceive. That becomes very second nature. So it's nurturing the body's intuition while deeply connecting you to like source wisdom. And it's actually capable of being taught very, very like succinctly. And so I have about 400 women who are utilizing the method. Now I would say probably 200 of them have been practicing the method for like somewhere close to 5 years now. I've been using it for, I think it'll be almost 12 years now. So successfully, by the way. And that's kind of my, passion and what I do in the world. And it actually brought us to this subject because, when you get taken off of birth control and your doctor basically says, oh, well, if you don't stop taking birth control, you're gonna die. You kind of have to stop. And I remember asking the doctor, I said, so if I can't use, chemical or hormonal birth control, what can I do? And he just kind of like laughed. He was like, good luck with that. It's the rhythm method at the time was like really the only other option. And he's like, but it's not very trustworthy. And he like laughed. And I remember feeling so broken and so devastated because my mother had 5 girls, and basically only two of us, which was my sister and I, had the same father. And I just really felt like I did not want to have, you know, any of my kids left out of having a father, or, you know, just that type of family dynamic was really important for me to hold, knowing how deeply it impacted me. And so that was definitely the impetus for me to start researching. And, you know, I, at that time, was a nutritionist and was under an apprenticeship of a nutritionist that had been a nutritionist for 25 years. She was absolutely incredible. And when I kind of shared with her what was going on with me, she said, well, you know, if anybody can figure it out naturally, I know you could, which was kind of like a brain expansion for me. Because it's like, who am I to figure out something that, you know, all these medical professionals haven't really fully wanted to dive into, because it's just so complex. So I'm just like, wow, like I could possibly break this apart and figure out a puzzle, right? So I kind of like just, you know, spent 9 years in doing this research. And in the research of like natural birth control, I started researching how and where birth control came from, and where natural birth control came from originally. And basically every single culture had a form of natural birth control. And that was like it was like a very in-depth, curious, like kind of digging around in just like little highlights of like, oh, this culture used this type of birth control. And many of them were very archaic. And some of them were so advanced that we just figured out, you know, where this, you know, Egyptian birth control method was, why it was actually effective. And it could be used, but there are some complications to using the Egyptian method, which is honey. So it changes the pH of the
using
yoni.
honey in the yoni.
Honey in the yoni. That is not my method. It's not my method for several different reasons, and in which case I will spare everybody those details.
Yeah. I can imagine there would be, I can already imagine some complications there.
I've made it a very easy system, so it's not as complicated as needing to figure out honey. But I definitely was able to just do the in-depth research of like, how did we go from natural birth controls to women having no connection to their body and believing that only a institution outside of their body could determine whether or not they could conceive or not conceive. And that was like a huge like light bulb of, okay, wow, this information existed, but then how did it go away? And how is it that so many women have no connection to this wisdom, right? And so as I started to dig into that, I started finding scholars, historians that were just, it was their field of study, which was the witch trials, and just basically the ancient histories of like how we came into modern society. And you have Sylvia Federici, I think is her name. I've never heard it spoken, so sorry if I butcher it. But she wrote Caliban and the Witch, and she has a very interesting take as well on the history of how we came to the present moment of where women are in society. And one of the things, well, one of the direct lines of conversations that I started noticing with all these specific scholars and historians were that they were very, very, very clear that where women are in society was sculpted and systematically. And that's kind of what the topic of what we're talking about today is really on, is, you know, I had mentioned that there was a specific sculpting of how women came into society now, and how I kind of formed my views and thoughts was really looking to the history and what historians who have done in-depth research kind of have to say about history. And so a lot of what I'm going to share is really like, it could be my point of view, but you could actually look up these individual scholars and take a look at their work. And I'm really just giving you an overview to where I put like the pieces together from each of the different people. So like, I'm not sure, did you want me to do kind of like a run through of it?
Yeah. Well, so firstly, I just noticed, like, I just kind of want to like map the trajectory of where we're heading. I feel like we're like, we've hit the runway and we're already like starting to lift off into the air. And I kind of want to like do the cabin check or something like that. It's like, so firstly, like listening to your journey, like I just sitting here feeling like a mix of emotions. Like I feel like when you mentioned the natural birth control method, and kind of like, I felt my heart really drop like into this like really appreciative space. Like there's something very tender and beautiful about that kind of level of empowerment for women to take that level of conscious volition around her body, and how her body not only is able to be sexual, but also to choose, to have direct choice around how life is brought into the world, how conception is formed. And then I also felt the heartbreak when you shared about kind of your own journey about coming to that, and the experience of like this sense of like, you've got no choice, you know, good luck, you know, and being like, what? And then just admiration for like, okay, well, I'll try and figure it out myself. And that long-term process that can be, I imagine, probably sometimes quite lonely, disheartening, challenging, you know, sometimes really exhilarating when something new is discovered, but like kind of a slog of like, I've got to keep going, you know, and figure this thing out and put these pieces of the puzzle. And then, so I'm hearing from this process, it's opened up a whole world for you. And so it became not just about the birth control. It started to become about the relation to your body as a woman, and then this sense of the mystery and what you were referring to as the witches, like the kind of the sense of the deep embodied wisdom in the mystery of woman being this kind of this archetype, or this sense of the witch, and then the background, the scholarly background that shows the ways that women have been shaped, potentially, I imagine, we haven't quite got there, but I imagine away from that innate wisdom and away from that mystery into wherever we are now. So maybe we can go from there. Like, where are we right now, and what is some of the shaping that's been happening?
Yes. Thank you for being able to just like drop into how, you know, your feelings of what it felt like in your body, to just hear me kind of share what I've shared. And, you know, the shaping of women in current society brought us to a place of being fully separate from our intuitive nature. And this intuitive nature is what gives us that birthright to understand how to conceive or to not conceive, right? And I say it's a birthright because as you start to dig into the information, you really understand how that is a truth that you feel inside your body, but you're just like, your mind needs to reconcile how that happened. So going way back, we're gonna just kind of like step into a moment of where I'm gonna like take us through like a quick timeline. Now, I could literally go in any direction, like any direction of like any of the different areas in detail. So I want to make sure that we don't get lost in a detail.
Okay. All right.
But I also feel like this is really important information. So you can stop me and we can talk about anything, but I just wanted to kind of share that with you. So
Okay.
you can rein me in again.
Noted.
Okay.
Noted. Yeah.
Okay. So in the beginning of time, and this is like when I say in the beginning of time, archaeologists have dug all over the world. When they've dug into a certain layer of the world, they are basically saying, okay, these are the origins of when Earth was created. That's kind of like how I'm speaking of, like the beginning of time. So, you know, it would be 0. And so when they started digging up, they started finding statues. And these specific statues were of what is now known to be Mother. There was no religion in the beginning. There was no idea of God. It was actually an idea of Mother, thinking that it was actually more correctly related to Mother Earth, and that she was, you know, giving us all that we needed. She was making sure that we were cared for and loved fully and wholly. Like all of the needs and necessities were being met and fully nourished. And so that idea was then put into a representation of a, like usually a little white, like carved woman that generally was represented as headless. And she had big breasts and a round body, and sometimes was even like depicted holding, suckling a little baby. And these statues were found all over the world, in every region of Earth. They basically have found these statues. So there is a hypothesis based on the fact that they're finding these very, very similar statues all over the world, and they call them Original Mother. And it was not even a religion, it was just a form of gratitude in the physical form. So it started as like maybe you would gift them to people. This is pure speculation, but maybe you would gift them to different people, or maybe you would have them as an altar. But we do know that they existed and they were a form of gratitude to say thank you for the sun coming up and coming down. Thank you for the food that I'm receiving. And that was basically the first form of religion, which was purely divine, feminine, like just pure love and pure gratitude. And then, of course, you know, as time goes by, you have like 400 AD when you start, AD, BC, sorry, BC, 400 BC, when you started getting more masculine or male gods coming into the mix. And it was more of the polytheism, where you had many different gods coming in, and they were very male gods, very masculine, very Adonis, like, you know, sculptured bodies, perfect. They had all these powers. The female god started to really take shape into multiple female gods, but were very flawed in many different ways. There were a few like the Taras that were depicted in the Chinese and like the Japanese cultures to be more
Taras?
and Taras, yeah.
Yeah,
like
in Tibetan Buddhism also.
and Tibetan, exactly. Many of the Asian cultures where they had a Tara representation, and they were goddesses more like from a perfect mindset. Indian also had them, but slowly and surely they started to get eroded to where they were depicted really small or not spoken about as much, and the male gods started to take more shape, where the women, like let's say in Greek mythology and histories, and the Romans as well, they started to make the women look more feeble, or they were the ones with temptations. And then you start bringing in the different religions that became like well known all over the world, in which case you really start to get a more masculine dominant religion started to take effect. Okay, so I'm going to pause right there because we're going to take another streamline and bring it in, which is we had a feudal system, which was basically most of what happened before the 11th century, all the way back to ancient societies. You had the feudal system that was in some variation or another, and there were many probably different names in there, but there was variations of the feudal system where somebody ruled over them, people, serfs, worked the land, basically cultivated the wealth, and then paid a very large tax to the people who were the rulers. Okay. So that is the serfdom of where, you know, you had no time. Time was like, you know, nebulous. Like time basically was just the sun coming up, the sun coming down. You ate when the sun was above you, you woke up when the sun rose, and you fell asleep when the sun set. Like that was all time really was. And they counted, you know, the months, but it was really based off of like the seasons, and not necessarily based off of like, I need to meet somebody at 3 o'clock today, right? That did not exist. It was like, oh yeah, we'll bring you the supplies soon. And they would, you know, make sure that it got to them before they needed it. That was it. So that is where you have the feudalism and the serfdom. And then around the 12th century, you had a very interesting thing like shift. There was capitalism that started to come into play. And when capitalism went from the feudalistic mindset of you work for us, we make sure all your needs are met, everything is taken care of, and then we basically tax you for most of the abundance, right? And you work the land. You did all of it pretty much like on their own. And they then had masters that watched over them and came and taxed them. Okay, so now you have capitalism, which switches over, and it's like literally like a tick in the time clock where all of a sudden time starts, because you're no longer given all of your needs. They found out, you know, the ruling class found out, oh, you don't actually have to pay for all of their needs to be met. They don't need a house to live in and a land to like work. Like we could just employ them for a position, and then that way we could just pay them, and then they have to figure out what to do with that money. Whether or not they have enough money to do with what they need is of no consequence, right? Well,
it's interesting the way that you're framing it right now. It actually, like, I noticed that my mind originally would thought, in one way, I think it seems like we've got a better deal with the introduction of capitalism, but the way you're framing it is actually like a worse deal in some ways as well. We don't like, it's kind of either or. It's not necessarily a better or a worse deal, but it's like this flip from, you know, you're a serf and basically a servant. You're working the land, but you have an independent kind of structure as long as you pay your taxes, to now you're directly employed, but we're not taking care of you at all. It's like we give you something and now you go away and do whatever you need with it.
And so it's like the way that the mind works, it's like we are shaped to believe what we believe now. And that is an undeniable truth, that if you do not know that and actually look at that with like a deep truth, you're missing something. And so and I want to go more into that in a little bit, but specifically speaking to having this change, right? It seems like a great idea, because people who had a place to live, you know, worked on a land. They were not transient. People would live in one place for their entire lives. It was actually very strange to go off and wander. I mean, that's great existence is beyond
crazy people.
Yeah, yes, it was only for the very brave and the crazy people. And so now you had opportunity that was off the land, and that you could actually make money doing something, maybe more money than just the little food that you received and working, laboring on land. You know, most people were farmers all the way up until the 19th century. And so, and the 20th century. So those two really like shifted, the industrial age shifted that entirely. But until then, most people worked the land. So the idea of being part of the bourgeoisie were the new class of people that received money, you know, for their goods, you know, something that they could acquire that the lords and ladies and ruling class wanted, was like, you could really move up in the world. So it was the opportunity that people loved, which is what everybody still connects with when it comes to capitalism. But it is that double-edged sword, right? It's like they get a little more autonomy, a little more freedom, and a little bit more capability of being able to be successful. But what was the cost of that? And I think that that's really what, when we're talking about how women are shaped in society, it was the cost of going into more opportunity, because it wasn't more opportunity for women. It was actually specifically less opportunity. Why? This is where it starts to get a little interesting. Is because in the 12th century, you had women who were leaders in obstetrics. They were scholars. They were actually very, very, very well known to be the brewers. And where they got the witch name was wise women. That's what witches actually mean. So the witches were the wise women, and the wise women wore the hats and had the broom and had the big pot, because they were the ones that made water drinkable. So they made magic. They had the brooms to push all of the oats, because they were making the beer, because guess what? Drinking water was very dangerous back in the day.
Wow.
And so
witches were the original beer makers.
Yes, they were. They were the original beer makers.
The witches made beer. Amazing. Okay.
They were the original brewers. They were the original ones who had figured out how to ferment, and that they figured out the fermentation would make it so you could drink and not die. So that's why everybody drank so much alcohol, was because it was safer than drinking water. And so there was like a lot of techniques and herbs and connections to the ways of the nature around them that these wise women held. It was the wise women who also held all of the information on natural birth control. And so that is where, if women have control over population, so there was always a wise woman, maybe two, sometimes three, depending upon the area and the size. But there was always a wise woman within, you know, stone's throw of a village, because women would go to them for this natural birth control. They would go to them, you know, the wise woman also would see, you know, what was going on in nature and go, ooh, we're going to have a shortage of food, and we're not going to be able to sustain or support these babies. They're going to die. So we should just make sure we're not birthing babies right now. And so women were given the tinctures, the herbs, the knowledge, and all of the information that they needed in order to not conceive. There was also lots of rape, and there was lots of other unsavory things that happened to women. It just really wasn't a very safe space. So going into the change of the 12th century, you had like the capitalism the idea that they needed a workforce. They needed a workforce. Now, there's different ideas of people saying, well, if there was, oh yeah.
Just before we go there, I get really curious. So this time where the women are kind of controlling the population, they're fermenting alcohol, they're making water drinkable. Like, what do you have a sense of what is the relationship between men and women at this stage? Like, how are they relating to each other? Do you have any kind of awareness around that? Like, what's going on there?
Well, I mean, that's a really great, and this is, you know, going to bring in a little bit of speculation, but in just hearing the scholars speak about it, I get the take that there was respect. There was a lot of respect for women based off of that they needed women. Women did not, like, men did not birth babies.
Yeah.
There was no men at a birth at all. They were kicked out of the room. There were some maybe like powerful rulers who were like, I'm going to be there. And, or fathers who were like, I'm going to be there. But unless it was an accident or they were very insistent on being there, there were no men anywhere near women while they were birthing. And so they needed these wise women, these so-called, you know, doctors then, or witches that were able to birth the babies. They needed the woman to brew drinkable drink or beer, but mostly it was just fermentation of many different sorts, right? So there was a sense of respect. They had respectable professions. They made money, and they were able to be heads and charges of households, which after the 12th century, there were a series of rules and laws that were starting to become more favored or popular, and popularized in the sense that rape started to become legal. It was mandated that rape was legal, and women were seen more as tools for birthing babies. And there was a sense of even a demonization of women after the 12th century. So before the 12th century, 11th century back, there were rulers. The rulers were on top, but otherwise women were actually able to like have land in scenarios of where if the woman was, you know, esteemed, she was intelligent, she was educated, she could actually receive the inheritance. And that became a very strong mandate. And of course, this varied from region to region, and there might have been regions where that never would have happened, but there were many cases where it did happen based off of just the respect that were given to some of these very notable female figures in history. So that's where you kind of take a look at like, wow, women actually had a place. Then in the 12th century was when many, many things started to change. And I can go into so many details on this, but
what are some of the things that had this shift occur? You know, that's like, what happened?
Ooh, okay.
Yeah,
so
at least a little bit.
Yeah, this is going to be a good one, because I feel like most people do not know the exact origins of how the Inquisition started, or the Spanish Inquisition started. And that's one where you get a really good feel for how like fate and how history played out was teetering on an edge of what life could have been very different, right? So in around 1210, and we say around 1210 because years were very fluid. Not every place had the same years. So we'll say around 1210, but it could have been like 1220 also. So it's like very, okay, so around 1210, there is a beautiful recounted religion that's called the Cathars. And the Cathars resided in multiple different places, but was very well known to have just kind of landed and resided and flourished in the south of France, which is now called the Lagoon d'Arc. And I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but it's spelled pretty phonetically for me, and that's the way I pronounce it. I'm not French. I am French, but I don't speak French.
Me too.
So, great. Okay. So, I'm sorry again if I say these wrong. These are my own self-exploration, so I have not heard anybody say Lagoon d'Arc. Okay, so you have the Lagoon d'Arc, and it's a city or a town in the south of France where they have beautiful churches constructed. The religion itself is supposed to be Christian based. However, they are very, very different compared to the Protestants and the Catholics. And so women are allowed to hold places in church. They don't eat meat. They abstain from sex. They are just very pure, very loving, and very when you speak about purity, most people's minds are like, oh, it's just a word, but they actually lived as examples. They were very, very devout in being what most religions try to be, is what they're depicted as. And that they don't force anybody to believe the way that they believe. They just live by example. They hold church, and anybody who wants to be a part of that, based off of their interactions with other people, then they're brought into the fold. If they choose to not adhere to all of the beliefs, that's okay, because everybody has their free will to be able to choose what they want to believe or adhere to or not. So it's a very fluid religion, and from many accounts of the Cathars that kind of made it through, which there are very, very few. So there's speculation that all of the history that we have or information on the Cathars that exist are from the victors, that are from the Dominicans. And so you basically, I have heard that there are underground histories that have come bubbled up, and so I kind of peppered in some of what has come up from underground secret societies have said about the Cathars. So these Cathars are living happily, flourishing. It's becoming more and more popular, this religion. So you have Pope I think he's Pope Innocent III, and he is considered one of the most famous and, for me, infamous popes that exist because of what he perpetrated on civilization in that time. And so basically you had a religion, the Catholic religion, that would go all over the world to save people. But there's a lot of politics in religion, unfortunately, even at that time. And so the politics in the religion at that time were, the idea was to go and save people, but it was also to make sure that everybody conformed to their religion so their souls were saved. But when you talk about either you conform or die, that's a little bit of where I think the line for me could have been drawn, right? Where the Cathars were the exact opposite. So you had what was seen by the Catholic Church when you had Dominique of, let's see here, this is where I want to make sure that I get the names, Dominique Guzman, and they called him Saint Dominique. And he basically traveled all over and stumbled upon the Cathars. And when he stumbled upon the Cathars, he saw how this religion, the Cathar religion, was flourishing, and he said, nope, no way. I need to talk about this heresy to the Pope. So he runs back to the Pope, and the Pope basically says, you know, all right, like, what's going on there? Because he's really frazzled about this, and is speaking about how they're heretics and that they need to be conformed, and that this is a serious threat to the Catholic religion. So the Pope says, okay, I'm going to send you with a group of monks, and you're going to go down there and you're going to see if you can conform them. And so he ends up going down there with what they call them now, the Dominicans. And that's their name in history. So the Dominicans went in, settled there, and tried to conform these Cathars. And the Cathars are just like, why would we do that? We're happy. We, you know, are peaceful and everybody's happy around us. Why would we conform to a religion that really makes us feel very unhappy? So that didn't work. And so basically, they were both very peaceful on each side. But, you know, the Dominicans were very concerned for their souls. And so there was an actual meeting that had happened where it was in a town hall, and one of the Dominicans was trying to preach and trying to share, and somebody basically said, nope, that's enough, you're not going to say any more. And there was a scuffle, and somebody gets killed. Now, one of the monks gets killed of the Dominicans. So then you have the Dominicans that go back to the Pope, and they say, one of our guys was killed. Like, this is, you know, this cannot be left unpunished. You can't kill a man of God. And so then the Pope basically starts the Inquisition. And so he gives the Dominicans the go-ahead to go down with an army to the Cathars, to the Lagoon Dock, a beautiful place in the south of France. And there was a complete annihilation of everybody down there. There was a clear understanding that the Dominicans were not in the right, that many of the Catholics that were in the area fought with the Cathars because they thought it was completely inappropriate. They'd known them for years, and, you know, like hundreds of years, family. So basically, you have these people who are now fighting for against their religion, Catholics fighting with Cathars, and the Dominicans just basically coming in. Now, you know, many of the people who were with the Dominican army said, so how do we know who to kill? Because this is, you know, like, there are obviously Catholics that are fighting with us. And there's an actual quote, which is the, there's a quote which is, here it is, that the Pope said, put all of them in to the sword and let God decide. So he basically just said, it doesn't matter if they're Catholics or they're Cathars, kill them all. And that's a very famous quote, because that was basically the justification and the very strong shift of mindset of where before they tried to peacefully convert people, but now a line had been distinctly crossed. This line being distinctly crossed of where it's okay to kill people in the name of God, which was a huge like you know, lightning flash in change of consciousness. So this started the Inquisition, and going forward killed hundreds of thousands of people. Now, one of the major things to note is that the Inquisition was a mindset that, you know, people wanted to belong to something. They wanted to feel like they belonged to something that was important. And so people backed this type of abhorrent behavior. Like there could have been at a certain point where this changed the face of history of people more, like let's say the Dominicans came and showed up and said, hey, no, I'm not gonna kill people, and like God decided I can't do that because that's not okay. But it was sanctioned by somebody who said that this was okay. You know, and we can imagine in, you know, other parts of history where this continued on, that mindset of like, oh, I'm going to justify killing people.
So this was a tipping point around 1200 where we've shifted from kind of a more peaceable environment, you know, obviously struggles and everything, but there's this equal opportunity between men and women, kind of equal space in society. Everyone has some kind of place, and suddenly through this decision by this Pope to be like, the Khazars are a problem, we want to do something, made that decision, the mentality, the mindset of like a more kind of like oppressive, or a sense of like, I'm now licensed to kill or oppress or shut down anyone who disagrees with my point of view, started to emerge in that.
Yes, kind of it started to emerge at that point in time in history. Now there were other like sparks, because I believe what we're able to look at is that this kind of this happened in Europe, which then they were traveling all around, and then other, you know, ancient cultures started to see that this was so easily accepted that they were like, wait, why are we trying to gain the trust and the love of people when we could just, you know, plow them over and have them repopulate? So this idea was really...
That word repopulate, that's a key, isn't it? That's kind of where we're heading, right? That I'm hearing that sense of control of the population, not control, but like moderation and mediation of the population, shifting from women away from women through this sense of we can just decimate populations and then repopulate them with people aligned with how we perceive the world is supposed to be, right?
And that is where you have the quantum shift of sculpting a society, which, you know, just even saying that, like my heart just kind of like skips a beat. It's like pounded in my chest, because it was from a place of where there was a genuine desire to try to keep everybody happy and rule and still hold that power position. But then it became like, oh, like we can just wipe the board out. Now, that was where you had women. Women were the holders of sacred information. They were intelligent, they were sharp, they were witty. And in many cases, you know, men would give a lot of the, you know, like they had a good wife, which made them a good man. It was seen in religion that was, you know, the way. You know, religion, when you start to really look into it, you begin to see that, like, while it has done many, many good things, and while it has created a conscience, I feel like even just recently, you know, there's a lot of things that religion, it's caused the most amount of death on this planet. Religion. And so that's kind of, for me, just like a really dark splotch in religion. I am very, very spiritual, and, you know, have studied multiples of religion. You know, for the past 5 years, I've been studying Buddhism, and I basically grew up, well, more Christian. My mom grew up Catholic and was around so many different religions. So I believe people are good, ultimately. But, you know, you can be deceived by religion, and that's an important thing to really make sure that you pay attention to, of just like, am I being sculpted?
So,
And
so we've got this shift that happens, and then we have the alongside the emergence of capitalism, I imagine a bit later after the shift. So let's kind of like take those points and fast track to us now, like how that sculpting has shaped us to the point where we are right now.
yes, okay. So basically, when you had all women that had any type of intelligence were burned, drowned, or stoned to death. And so all of these women died, right? Just
And
kind
what
of
was
like,
what was the direct rationale behind that? Behind
was that they
the witch
were
hunts?
committing heresy. So if you didn't believe in their religion, then you were a heretic, and
Right.
therefore you were a devil worshiper, you were an evil witch, and you had to be put to death for the safety of everybody.
Yeah, and so and the religion itself had no space for these wise women. So there was no. That's what I'm imagining. There's no space for these wise women. So if they continued to inhabit their roles in society, automatically they were heretic to the religion, to the church, just by the nature of them fulfilling their role. So there was like, it's either conform or be put to death.
And the conform looked like, once a lot of the women were wiped off the table, and in some areas in Germany, so many women would not conform that there were many towns noted in history where they just killed all of the women and men. I mean, you're talking in one town, 900, and this is documented, 900 women and men were killed for not conforming. And like, I just got chills, but
Yeah,
there's a part of me that is completely and utterly like broken by hearing that, and then there's another part of me that is like, that is how strong these wise women and wise men were in that time. I mean, I had chills from head to toe.
Yeah,
but the point being is that if you had anything to say about anything, like, you were not safe. So mothers looked to their daughters and said, shh, don't say anything. Don't speak. You're just seen. You're not heard. Don't have an opinion. You can't, like, the more meek, the more shut down you are, the safer you are, which was, like, the mother genuinely cares for her daughters. Like, it's not that she doesn't want her child to flourish and be a strong, abundant woman. She's literally trying to save her from dying. That's the mindset. So coming into current day society, right, you have women who have been acculturated into being subservient, not being able to speak your mind, not really having much to add. And even if they were adding something important, like, let's say they ran a good household, or they managed all the books, they were never given credit for it. But I think men started to see after a while, like, having female partners that literally didn't say anything and had no importance whatsoever besides popping the baby out were boring. And so I think that you had a kind of an awakening, especially in the 20th century, in the late 20th century, to where men were starting to go, oh, wow, a woman who's flying around the world, that's kind of like cool. She's interesting and different. And so you started to spark like an idea of where women started to like shift out of like, if you say something, you're going to die, which, by the way, still exists. I mean, there was a woman in 2011 in, I can't remember where. It's in the Middle East, where she was beheaded for witchcraft. It still happens. In the United States, it was in the 1970s that a woman was jailed for witchcraft. So there's, it's still there. And I noticed
even in myself, and it's like really uncomfortable to admit, like, to hear this, and I can see it's shining a light on these deep subconscious belief structures that it's like, that's not mine, but why is that existing in my brain? And it's like, I can even see my own biases there that are like so nonsensical, because, you know, I have lots of really beautiful, intelligent women in my life and in my field, and I have no sense, but I can see like, oh, there is a belief structure inside that holds that isn't even that. I didn't adopt that, you know, but somehow that's in there, you know, and so I can see, oh, okay, there's a collective field that's still struggling against this.
Yes, I mean, and we're still struggling against it now. I mean,
Yes.
the way that we're struggling against it now has shifted.
Yeah.
And just to put that into context is, what is a quack? What is, you know, somebody who knows how to utilize herbs and actual earth wisdom? They're looked down upon, and now starting to receive some type of notoriety because, you know, the trust and the feeling that the traditional medical, you know, establishment has and knows all the answers is starting to get a little warbly based off of actual doctors studying natural integrative medicine and nutrition. And I was blessed to have learned from Dr. Bowman nutrition, and, you know, his ideals and thoughts around it. I mean, he spent 25 years studying, and he's still practicing. He's like in his 80s, and he still like has a practice. Like you can't say that about a lot of, you know, older males, where they're just so full of vitality and life based off of earth wisdom. It's starting to really, you know, shine through what really does help the body to be healthy. So, you know, for many years, I was trained with a nutritionist who was very clear: you can only say certain things, and you can't say these things, because if you do, you could be bloated up.
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
still that hush mentality. Yeah.
And you will disappear. And
Yeah.
and it's unfortunate, but, you know, my biological my biological grandfather is somebody who is very well known, and he cannot come into the States because of something he found out, which I don't often tell people this. It's like another really personal thing that most people don't know about me. But, you know, my biological father or grandfather is Jim Humble. And so he basically found MMS. And yeah. And so because he wouldn't let it go, and he knew that it would save millions of people's millions of lives, that he wouldn't let it go, and has continued at, you know, a great deal of self-sacrifice on his part to make sure that this information continues to be available for people. But he had to actually make a church so that way he could give the information about MMS. And he has not been allowed in the country for, like, I mean, I met him twice. And the first time I was 8 years old or 7 years old. And that was like my one and only like real like interaction with him. So it's definitely like imprinted upon my DNA because of, you know, my family on my mother's side, and in both the patriarchal or the my mother and father's side. So it's definitely in my genes to be persecuted, and so it's like it's very scary to admit that. But, you know, a lot of people go, oh, that's just hearsay, and oh, this, you know, I've seen what it's done for people. Like when you see it, touch it, taste it, and feel it, like I should have been dead multiple times, but I actually was, you know, injured by the birth control that I took, and it was an injection, and that caused me to get very sick. I had to become a nutritionist to save my life, because that was another one where doctors were like, you don't know what's going on. So it's not that I believe that traditional medicine has a place, a very strong place. It's great for emergencies. It's great for diagnostics. It's great for surgeries and so many different aspects. But it's also like there's a point where when it comes to women's health, like they know a lot of like the physical details, but as I started to dig through all of this, I started to realize like, whoa, what I've come up with and how I take care of my, yoni is very different than what is taught. And yet women who follow what the, doctors are teaching, they get a lot of urinary tract infections, yeast infections, and the only time
endometriosis and all kinds of digestive issues. And like, I have this really strong awareness that in my understanding, most women that I know struggle with some form of difficulty in terms of their reproductive or digestive health, more so than men in my life. And like,
Yes.
It breaks my heart when I tune into it. It's like there's some kind of strange assault on a woman's physiology that I can't make sense of, but it hurts to think about.
We're just so much more susceptible than men are
Yes.
to chemicals. And we have chemicals infiltrated in every different direction. And we just have sensitive systems. We're the procreators. And I find men can touch chemicals. They can get, like piping adhesive on their skin, and they're just like, I'll wipe it off in a minute.
Yeah, I got super glue all over my hand the other day, and I'm like, oh, okay, it's all right.
And a lot of women I know, they've gotten stuff on their hands, chemicals, and it like hurts. It physically hurts or burns, or like it's definitely like an intense feeling of like, whoa, I have an airheaded feeling if I get super glue on me. There's just a sensitivity that I feel women have more so than men, and that's where, for me, it was like finding this divine, like stepping back into it. And I feel like this is where we're heading for women, just because like where I came from and all of the information was divinely guided. I mean, to be honest, I don't know how else to say it, but my experience, every single one of them, and it was rough. Like I was allergic to everything. It was one day I got a shot, the next day, and it was the second shot in the series. So it was like the next day after the second shot, I literally lost my immune system. It was insane. Imagine eating a banana and having it like almost an anaphylactic response, like swelling out past your neck and not being able to like breathe, and having a fever of 102 to 107 for like 8 days. Like that was like a very serious learning curve of like where I came from. And the doctors were like, antibiotics don't work. We don't really know what to do. It was life and death, touch and go for almost 2.5 years. And then I ended up working with a woman who took me on as an apprentice that brought me through every single portion of the body. And I mean, I just from point A to point B went through it all and was able to get myself to health. And then at that point I was like, okay, I have to go to school for this. So I then went through a whole program with a doctor that basically was just like, doctors don't know how to, teach people to eat. So we need to teach people to eat. So I'm going to create a program that goes through all of the health, issues and how to eat for that. So it's definitely like where women are going. They're rediscovering that if they live in the way that they were taught to trust, they become very overweight, unhealthy, and sick. And a pill doesn't seem to fix it. So it's unfortunate because it takes some people to get to that point before they try to fix it. But imagine if we actually just taught people body awareness to begin with. Taught them to understand like, oh wow, like I'm feeling really tired and sluggish. Oh, I know exactly what it is, and then taper that back, because like that's like taking care of your body like a temple. It's the self-care and the love and knowing that like when you go overboard with something that it is only harming yourself. So it has nothing to do with like right now we have the captain in the bathrooms cleaning the head, and you have the janitors, you know, in the captain's seat trying to steer, and you have all the different pieces of like our systems kind of discombobulated, but it actually, you can teach yourself how to get that captain back in the seat and the janitor in the right place, the cook in the kitchen, and that way you're no longer eating for pleasure. You're gonna eat for health because that's what makes you feel better, you know, in every single way, in the mind and the body and the spirit. So that's kind of like,
yeah, I want to get to where we are right now. So we've gone through this journey of understanding, on the premise of understanding how, in particular, partly how society has been shaped, but in particular how women have been shaped in society. And not only women, but also like body-based wisdom or body-based understanding has been shaped. So we've gone through this journey of, through this kind of inquisition process, through the shutting down of basically the understanding that we could oppress people into conformity and basically destroy them if they didn't want to, and this loss of the reproductive rights of women, and then the sense of hush hush, women's wisdom being lost because if you speak up, you're a heretic, you're going to be destroyed. And we've come to this point in society where there's a little bit of breakout of that, but there's still this kind of clutches of like, we don't want to lean, like there's still, so what I'm hearing in particular here, and where you're taking a stand for, and I take a stand for in a different way as well, we're at a point where we kind of, for most part, we offset everything to the experts, the expert doctors, the expert psychologists. So something that I'm quite passionate about. So I'm hearing for you, there's like a really strong importance of like learning to understand our own bodies and our own body wisdom. So we have charge of our own health. I'm the same in terms of psychological health, and in terms of how we can actually learn kind of psychological tools and understandings to help each other, where we don't necessarily need to always be looking at the psychiatrists and psychologists and all these experts, where we actually start to, you know, I'm also a permaculturalist and I love growing food. So it's like, how do we take this back into our own hands so we're actually in a more empowered society? And so that's what I am starting to hear. And I'd love to hear kind of your reflections on where you see us going and what you'd love to see for a future for women, but also women in relationship to men, in relationship to how we exist together, knowing that this is where we're at right now.
Yeah. And I think the best way to address that is right now we're realizing that we've been sculpted.
Yes.
And
but not only just women, like men have been sculpted too. We've been sculpted into this understanding, and there's bias against women, like even being able to identify myself and be like, that's not something I want for myself. And like, oh, there's like parts of me that through this educational system, this long legacy from this time, we've all been sculpted to believe in a certain way.
Right, exactly. And now we're kind of like literally like a multiple personality. you have one part of you that is like, oh, you have to believe doctors, you have to like know that they know what's best for you. And then there's like the part of you that's like, oh wow, like I took, you know, good fats and I'm starting to pay attention to not eating hydrogenated oils, but that really has made a big difference for me. And I've cut down on sugars because, you know, I'm realizing, you know, that sugars aren't really good for me anymore. And then like the more you're just like, whoa, like everything I'm putting in. So you kind of have these like this dichotomy that's happening, and I feel like right now they just kind of split. Like they just kind of have like, okay, I get to take a path right now, and there's like a splitting of idealisms of like where you have women who intuitively, like I've spoken to doctors, and I lived in Berkeley for the past 5 years, so I had several friends who were becoming osteopathic doctors, and were learning, many of my friends were actually therapists. And so there was like this really strong adherence to, you know, like I go to a doctor when I'm sick, and then they started kind of getting an experience with a nutritionist, and nutritionists started exploding all around, and they're like, oh, well, that's kind of interesting. And then I started having people asking me just outright question after question after question. And I kind of had to go, oh, okay, we need to set an appointment. But there's this splitting apart. And I think that what we really need to do is recognize that when you say only the expert knows everything about you, that you kind of have to break through that jail system that has been placed by hundreds of years. You do not know anything as an individual. You cannot possibly know. You haven't been trained, and unless you're trained, you could only do harm, right? And I feel like that's kind of what we're breaking out of right now. And one of the major ways to break out of that is the cultivation of intuition. And, you know, I find so many people, and I've consulted hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of clients over 17 years. And one of the major things that I find is that when somebody has not tuned in, they have not connected to their spirit and to their soul and to source energy, Mother Earth, and taken the time to quiet themselves and to just listen. Doesn't matter if there's a whole bunch going on, but just taking the time to listen. You don't trust yourself and you don't trust your intuition. And that's what's been imposed on us. So getting out of that, you're starting to get people where now they're trusting their intuition more than they're trusting what they're told. And that's a huge portion of where we're at right now, to get into a place of where we can start trusting ourselves, start learning earth wisdoms. I call it original mother. I call it like getting into finding, like, when you can ask yourself a question and you can know for a definitive fact that it is true. It takes a lot of cultivation. It takes a lot of trust in who you are, and knowing that, like, every single time you had an intuition that it's been 100%, like, that's when you've cultivated the wisdom within yourself. It's something that can be taught, just as the same way as it was untaught for hundreds of years. It took 400 years to unteach this wisdom, this innate ability to trust in that intention.
And even
intuition.
then, it couldn't fully be extinguished. It's the moment the pressure is gone off, it's naturally, that's what I'm hearing, it's naturally bubbling up again, you know, and that's that kind of that split between, hang on a second, that doesn't feel right anymore. That these expert doctors, like, more and more people are like, hang on. So it's like an individual kind of split, but there's also a collective one as well. There's also an emerging this differentiation between those who are wanting to stay on that trajectory of outsourcing intelligence, and those who are wanting to, like, actually, how do I come back into my own intuition, my own wisdom, my own understanding, my own deepening of my wisdom and intelligence?
Exactly. And that's kind of like, you know, you're like walking into that integrity and sacred container. And I feel like, you know, so it's like words. If we can really start getting into the understanding of words and the depth of meaning of them, because we use words flippantly and flagrantly. And in using words where they're not really, like, encompassing the meanings of them, like when I talk about sacred container, it's integrity. It's being able to, like women will often, you know, because they want a man, or it's like women or men will lie and cheat and, you know, do all kinds of things, but that ultimately is not integrity. And many of these people haven't been taught integrity and the joys of peace of having integrity for yourself, not for anybody else. And the sacred container is not using your femininity as a means to do anything other than like know what is truth and what is stepping forward on the path. And it's like that this is where the Buddhism kind of comes out, and I just really appreciate all the different religions and their teachings, because you know, I think that people just assume that they know everything, when really it's like, can you get really humble and ask, what do you truly know? And this pertains to the divine intuition and to femininity in a very important way, because what happens is when you have women who say, well, my intuition is saying this, and their intuition isn't actually saying that, but they're saying that just because they want that. That's where the integrity in the sacred container starts to become of utmost importance. Why? It's because it was abused in the past, and how we kind of switched over was abuse. It's the same way. The feminine ruled for thousands of years, abused its femininity, its divine intuition, being so directly connected to source, that then the men kind of took over, and now we've swung the other way in the pendulum. So now what we see is we kind of have to come back to center, and it's not easy. it's work, it takes care, and as anybody who is, you know, in the therapeutic world and the therapy world, like, it takes time and attention and a lot of internal work to be able to get yourself in a solid centered place of where you know you're in integrity.
And I hear that integrity and that intuition, and I just wanted to like highlight that sense of sometimes like to find that intention of is my intuition the genuine, or is it a craving, or is it an aversion, or is it is it my body, my gut flora, is it actually so conditioned to believing, to wanting this thing that it's telling me I want this thing that actually isn't wanted for me? Or if we're moving in more into psychological realms, is my attachment system telling me that I want, that this thing isn't good for me, or this thing is good for me, when it's actually my brain going haywire, and it's got nothing to do with intuition at all. So it's this, I hear this time taken to actually kind of cut through all of the stuff and get clearer and clearer and clearer what is actually my intuition. Because a lot of the time, you know, and I've seen this for myself and I see this a lot in others, what is called intuition is a lot of the time isn't actually intuition.
It's the exact opposite. It's your higher spirit saying you need to learn this lesson over and over and over again. But I find, you know, a lot of people are switched, and you know, I've done a lot of energetic work, and I studied with a crystal therapist as an apprenticeship as well. And so I've done a lot of energetic work. I'm also an EFT practitioner and, you know, nutritionist. So I've spent a lot of time on the energy of the body. But what I find is when I test people, they're switched. So they're constantly sending out energy from their source, their heart. So they're constantly just giving energy out. So when they go to sleep and wake up, they're like, I'm just as tired as I went to sleep. Well, one of the major things I noticed that was a huge component of being able to receive energy from source, from Father, from the universe, all that is, and Mother Earth coming up, right? And it's consistently feeding you if you're in integrity. So what is integrity? Just to simplify it out, is like, okay, well, I want to eat something. I'm hungry, right? Well, let's just say you have candida, which is a representation of your body is switched. It's giving energy out, right? And so you're like, I'm hungry. I'm going to eat pasta because I like really want pasta. But when you check in with yourself, you know you really don't want pasta. But you are being told by something outside of yourself, which is Candida albicans, which is a yeast that makes you crave. It gets into your nervous system and it makes you crave what it wants to eat, even though it's really going to create acidity in your system and doesn't, you know, foster health. So being in integrity is to be able to check in and know, oh, I should eat, you know, some vegetables and a nice portion of meat, or some squash and a nice portion of vegetables, or, you know, something that is not going to nurture the yeast. And so again, it's like just simply going, oh, I'm aware that there's something there that's wanting me to do what is not necessarily what's good for me, right? It's the acknowledgement and awareness that we are in control of ourselves, and that's the integrity. So that's like maybe not a simplistic way of putting it, but a nutrition way of putting it that's easy to wrap the head around, of being able to go, am I integrity? Somebody could be like, oh, I'm integrity for, you know, taking this bottle of water. Because I'm thirsty. But if that bottle of water, you know, somebody's relying or depending on it, and it's going to be gone, it's like, oh, that's not a, you know, great idea. And that's not an integrity.
Yeah, I've been
so tempting.
Totally, I've been thinking of integrity a lot lately, in a couple of different ways. And one way that I'm hearing you and I'm really enjoying as well, it's like having a set of standards for self and then sticking to them no matter what. And that's the hard part of, like, my standard is to be healthy and have high energy and to do and then the integrity is to uphold that, even though I'm hungry and I want the pasta or whatever, you know. And it's like, and it's hard, and we slip up, you know, and then we like come back to the level of integrity, and then slip up and then come back to the level of integrity. And it's across all domains, not just nutrition. It's like, in terms of who am I engaging with as a romantic or sexual partner, you know, my integrity is to only be with people who make me feel safe and calm and nourished. But then that person kind of really turns me on, so I go with them and then go, oh no, I slipped up, I need to come back to that integrity, to that level of standard for myself.
And I'm really glad you mentioned that, because I feel like that's a huge part of divine intuition for the feminine, is that, you know, I've heard you mention this like a few times, just in your Facebook posts, about how, you know, a lot of women are attracted to partners that are not necessarily like good choices for long-term partners. And so it would be an incredible, like, just visual thought moving forward of, like, if women were like, I'm not going to have that pasta man, you know.
Yep.
But I can like really be happy with like this incredible scrumptious, like extra top things, and it's like, that's good for me. And I had this realization very young. I was very lucky to have an incredible therapist, and this therapist, you know, basically assessed me, and I was 15, and this therapist assessed me, and she said, you know, choose, you know, to have healthy partners in your life. And she's like, I think really that's how I can help you the most. And what was so beautiful about that is she basically said to me, look, whoever you're attracted to, she's like, they're going to be bad for you. She's like, they're going to be really bad. Why? Because your internal compass is opposite. It's off. You are switched, girl, right? So in that switched moment, she said, the next time a guy who you are not attracted to approaches you and is being really nice and like is showing interest, even though you don't really feel it, just approach this like you're going to be friends with them, and it's okay, and you can be open to that possibility. She said, I guarantee you, you're going to be attracted to the bad boy. You're going to be attracted to the person who is literally going to be the most unfulfilling partner for you, because you have to learn who the fulfilling partners are. She stepped my world up like that. Like, I had a long-term boyfriend at 15 for 5 years. My next partner was a 5-year long-term, amazing, both amazing relationships. So in that, it was like a realization that we, as women, get really lost in our partners, and it's hard when you are lost in a partner to find your own intuition. And that's a huge part, is just realizing that if the world were in a beautiful place, men who could not show up, who was a mess, like women were given the tools to be like, oh, I don't need your attention. I know I have friends and I know how to interact with them in a non-sexual way. And I'm going to wait for an amazing person who's like fulfilling to me, because I know who I am. And that is where we're really going. That is like my purpose. And I'm cultivating this work in such a sacred container that it's gaining the traction with the integrity and the care and the slowness. I've been offered to be funded 3 times now. And one of the times was from the same person. So I've been offered to be fully funded 3 times, and 2 of those times were by the same person. So over a span of like 3 years. So it's definitely like, I knew at that time it wasn't right. And I knew that if this information and the intuition in myself knew that if I like took that money, and someone would have been out there, like people would have been utilizing the method on a much larger scale. But I knew, I saw it, I could see it feel it in my heart, in my stomach, that if I took that money, it was going to go away. It had not come to a place of where women were ready, or I was ready, or the information was ready. And all of those have been slowly like worked into a place where I'm like, oh, I can feel it. It's coming close, I'm cultivating it, and many of the pieces have now locked into place. And it was the divine intuition in knowing that, like, I wanted it so bad 5 years ago, and I was pushing for it, and I continued pushing for it, but without making it big. I just said, okay, I'm doing a workshop, 12 people showed up, great, that's what it's supposed to be. Like, I just kind of like allowed that until I reached like 400 plus women who now are using the method, and I know this information will live on.
I just want to, I just got a really strong hit of like kind of wrapping this all up, in all that you've said, and in this last piece that we just spoke about. So we went on this journey where women were the like, what's the right word? Not the protectors, but I can't think of the right word. They were the custodians of basically the population through natural birth control, through their ways of how they were choosing partners, everything like that. So that was the original role here. And then we went through this phase where that was cut off, and there was this sense of like, no longer did women have a choice around controlling the population. They became child rearing machines, basically to and I really hesitate. I don't want to say men, because that's what I've really heard in you. It's got nothing to do with man or woman. It was an oppressive religious structure that, that was male dominated, but hurt men in that time as much as it did women. So even though we don't have to go there, we haven't gone there. So we've had this, and that's kind of formed and shaped our society, where women just basically were at the whim of being population rebuilders for this narrative, sculpted to serve this narrative. And then we come to this place now where we're starting to gain the power back, and women, like in the method that you're teaching us, are being able to gain control over their own bodies, their own reproduction choices. And then also what we were just speaking to then, of something that I feel is really important for women to understand, is that women actually, especially now, more and more have the control or the power in sexual selection. So as women take that ownership and go, I am able to choose when and how I conceive a child, and I'm able to choose the partner through which I conceive a child, that will reshape society. As a man, if I am now having to show up in a certain way in order to meet a woman, to meet a quality woman, I will change to move towards that. That will shift me as men. That will shift men. If men can no longer get away with bad behavior and get women as a result of that, when women go, like you said, I don't want the pastor man, I want the vegetable man, I want the nourishing, men will go, oh, I have some work to do. You know, I have to show up in this way. Otherwise, and luckily we're starting to move more and more towards a legal structure and a social structure that supports that. Perhaps a little bit too far, whereas honestly, my position as a man is becoming increasingly precarious. I've been feeling that a lot lately. But nevertheless, that we're moving in that way, that women are empowered in that level of choice and are able to make, especially when in that level of integrity, dropping back into that intuition, are able to start shifting society towards kind of this more reverent, more, what was the headless mother figure again? The original mother, kind of bringing the original mother back into this field, into this shared society, this shared human species that we're in.
Yeah, and I feel like we've been off balance towards the masculine for a long enough period now, where we've actually we're now kind of cycling through the masculinity in women seen as femininity.
Yes.
And so we're now starting to be like, hey, that's not fair. You mean I have to work all day and I have to come home and then I have to rear the kids and make the food and clean the sheets and do all these things. And even if you have help, you still are the one orchestrating it, where the guy like maybe goes to work and comes home and is like, where's my dinner, right? Mm-hmm. Now you also like are starting to see like where there's deviations in that, like where I had a partner who had, you know, a meal made for me every single time I like came home, and I had like every iteration in between that also. But I'll tell you what, the partners that showed up with being able to handle the like the normal life tasks as well were so enriching in a partnership, and feeling like that was really fulfilling relationship, where it just felt like at a certain point where I was basically had a career and then doing everything and then expecting to like get pregnant and become a mom and still do all, I was literally like, my mind started to like melt. And I was like, wait a minute. I was like, I'm on to you.
Yeah.
And that's when I really started to feel like, whoa, I'm not adhering to the feminist like mindset fully anymore. I just can't. If I'm listening to my intuition, I now know that like that does not feel good. And if you look at it, like I feel like we need to kind of merge a traditionalist like mindset of, you know, a husband and wife where you're not the one expected to do everything, and you can step out of like the rules, things that make you happy in a relationship. I found the best relationship that I had. I'm in a happy relationship right now, but one of the best relationships that I had was a partner who everything I hated to do, he loved to do. It was like the best. I was like, you mean you love cleaning the kitchen at 4 a.m.? Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
So like really picking partners for the things that like, you know, your strong points. And if you find that like your partner has 5 strong points, like what are the other points? And if you want to pick those up, like, hey, that's a good combination. So that way we're not really like holding to a space of where like the man has to do everything masculine, but it's really like finding joyous relationships that really nurture you to become your best person. And that is where you're balanced. That is where you have joy and like cultivate that divine intuition.
Yeah, mutually empowering relationships.
Mutually empowering relationships.
Yeah.
It always comes down to that.
Yeah, totally. And one of the things that I've been thinking is like, you know, relationships, particularly romantic partnerships, take up so much of our time that if they're not generative, that's a huge portion of our time that is going to be lost in terms of trying to just deal with the intensity of being with someone who does not match or meet us or empower us.
Totally.
And it's
yeah.
the cost is too high. The cost is too high to bother with that, really. It's where I've come to. You know?
Yeah, that's a whole nother podcast for me, which would be very, I would love to hear a lot more of your thoughts on that for sure. But I'm sure I could keep going and going, and I want to make sure that you're checking.
Yeah, I have to. I do have to head off. That was really wonderful. I would love to just as we wrap up, you can maybe let people know where they can find a bit more about your work, and in particular this natural birth control method.
Yeah, super easy. It's eosoma.org, and it's eosoma.org. And it's my website, and I'm also on Facebook, and it's just eosoma with no .org is my Facebook URL. And I am currently working on a video workshop series that will basically give you a full workshop series that'll teach you the birth control method. I can't say birth control, it's actually a non-hormonal pregnancy prevention method or fertility control method, because birth control is a coined term by the medical industry. So I redact that. But that's like the best way moving forward to be able to learn my method. And I will have multiple series available. I already have most of the content for skin health care for both internal and external, like the tips and tricks and like specific details on how to take care of individualized skin, and also taking care of proper yoni health. So that's another one. And I will be putting together a program to teach kids ages 7 to 15. That's body awareness and proper healthy interaction between the opposite sex. And it turns into age-appropriate sex education. So that way you can teach kids how to interact in a non-sexual way while being aware of their bodies, and that way they're not needing that attention by sex. They can actually have substance to who they are and know how to cultivate that with everybody.
That's so beautiful. Thank you for the work that you're doing. That was lovely. What a pleasure.
Oh, well, thank you again for having me. It's been wonderful. And I am just really grateful for the time spent to just really like bring this topic of conversation, because I feel like it's like the inkling in the back of everybody's heads that doesn't really kind of get the attention.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm just passionate about seeing where we could go as a species, you know, and I really do think we're at a crossroads right now, and if we don't make some serious choices right now, we will not be around as a species any longer. And I mean, that's fine. The Earth will carry on and the universe will carry on, but yet I also believe that we also have immense potential as a species to create an incredible utopia on this planet with each other.
We are in such a beautiful place to create that, and I think the most important thing, if I could leave with some wise words, is to remember the Earth doesn't need us. We need the Earth.
Yeah, beautiful.
Thank you so much, Dana.